Hey guys, just a quick note before we start this week's show. Just wanted to let you know last week I was not present because unfortunately we lost our pet cat Biscuit, who had been with me for 16 years. Unfortunately, she did pass away. So while dealing with that and some other family issues, I unfortunately had to miss 1 week's episode. This is a one-man show, so unfortunately when life happens, sometimes I will have to step away. That being said, happy to be back. Happy to have you with us, and we should be back to a normal schedule. Thank you so much for your support. As always, clear skies. Listening to the Astro Cams. Welcome back to the Astrocast. It's me, your host, Drew. It is Tuesday, March 19th, 2024. We've got about half a moon up in the sky right now. We are approaching the solar eclipse, the big one, is coming up in just a couple of weeks now. If you are lucky enough to be in an area of the world where you can see that, as Neil deGrasse Tyson put it, it's going to be the America eclipse because it will be going through most of North America. Luckily, they say because of the particular path that this solar eclipse is taking, it will be more than likely the most viewed solar eclipse in the history of man, which is a pretty interesting thing to think about. In all of the solar eclipses that we have had in the entire history of mankind, this one is likely to be the most viewed. So I mentioned it a few weeks back ago on the show, but I actually got to view the total solar eclipse in 2017. I was lucky enough, it passed through South Carolina. So it was only about an hour's drive away from Charlotte to get to totality. So I definitely took advantage of that situation. I was very tempted to make travel arrangements to go see the total eclipse this year. But I tell people if I didn't have bad luck, I would have no luck. And I can't fathom driving 13 hours and getting clouded out. I know me and I know it would happen. So I'd end up spending all that money and, taking all that time off of work and all the resources and I would just get clouded out. So I decided to forego it. I figured I was lucky enough to experience it in 2017. I'm not going to get greedy. That being said, if I'm still here when the next one rolls around in 42 years, I believe 44 years, I will definitely go and check that one out. Now, that being said, if you're within, 2 or 3 hours drive, heck, if I was in 6 hours drive, I would go check it out. I can't bring myself to drive 13 hours. 13 hours is a long drive, guys. I drove to New York City a couple months ago with my wife. We went up there for her birthday. It was a trip. We went up there and we saw Wicked on Broadway. It was something that she always wanted to do. And it was a 13-hour drive. And I make a 6-hour drive, 6 to 8 hours, depending on where we're staying, pretty regularly, at least every year. And that's not too bad. So I said to myself, 13 hours isn't that bad. Oh, it is. It's that bad. It's incredibly long. And if I ever have to do a 13-hour drive again, I will definitely stop halfway through and get a hotel room, or better yet, I'll just fly. But again, if you're within a reasonable day's drive, highly recommend you go and try to check that out. Solar eclipse, definitely going to be worth seeing. And that's coming up on April 8th. Just a couple weeks away. So I told you last week that I was recording the show a little bit early because we got to see Neil deGrasse Tyson live and he was phenomenal. I really, really, really enjoyed his show. I knew he was going to be good. I didn't think he was going to be that good. I was kind of blown away by how good he was. So apparently, when he tours, he has like 12 different lectures. It's like a grab bag of lectures that he gives, and he lets, whoever who is hosting him pick what the topic is going to be. And he went with astronomy bizarre for the topic. So it was basically several different, topics on astronomy. He covered all kinds of things: black holes, white holes, comets, the Earth is trying to kill you was very enlightening and hilarious. And he is such a truthful person that it's hilarious. Like he's not afraid to let science speak for itself. And I think in today's world, that is becoming scarcer and scarcer. It's kind of scary, honestly, how many people are afraid to just, believe in science. What was a foregone conclusion 10, 15 years ago is no longer such a thing. So big props to Neil deGrasse Tyson. Thoroughly enjoyed his show. I think if I had to think what my favorite part of the show was, that would probably be when he enlightened me on something that I was unaware of. I'm sure a lot of people have probably heard of the double slit experiment in quantum mechanics, where the very act of observing the experiment changes the outcome. And he basically explained how this is not something like spooky, like by us just observing it, that very act, there's nothing spooky to it. The way he explained it is that the camera's photons, basically the shutter of the camera, us recording the electrons that are passing through the slit, actually interferes at a molecular level with those waves, and that is what causes the disturbance. I didn't know that. Nobody explained it to me in those simple terms, and all the times that I have heard that experiment referred to, and I always thought that it was something spooky, like he said, and I never realized that. So those are the kind of things that he explains, and I thought that was great, because I honestly thought that that was something that had not been truly understood yet in physics. I did not realize that it was literally essentially the camera shutter, and I'm dumbing it down significantly, obviously, but the act of the camera shutter is interfering with it in such a way. But it's not that, just looking at it with your eyeball is what's happening. It's the process is interfering with it. So if we could see with our own eyes those electrons and not interfere with them with our tools that we have to use to see them, in other words, then they would not be interfered with. But unfortunately, we have to use tools and science to measure things, and those tools interfere with the results. And when you get down to the quantum level, there's absolutely no way around that. So I thought that was really cool, the way he described that. Also loved the way he described black holes. Comets were great. He talked about all of the various objects that are in the path of orbit for the Earth, which was kind of terrifying because he brought up the first page and he said, I want you to look at this. This is a list of all of the objects that we have found that are on the same orbital trajectory as the Earth that will at some point, cross paths with the Earth. And there was like hundreds of things on this page, and everybody kind of gasped in the audience, and he was like, oh no, that's not it. And then he goes to the next page and the next page and the next page. And it was just hundreds after hundreds after hundreds of objects that we have found. And that's, not even close to all of them that are out there that are, potentially going to impact us one day. I mean, not even potentially. One of them will impact us one day. It's not even a matter of if, it's when. So that was quite enlightening to see as well. So I just wanted to give you guys a brief recap on that. If he ever comes to your town, though, I would highly recommend that you go see him if you're a fan of science. And if you're listening to this show, I would assume you're a little bit of a fan, and he is absolutely hilarious. He had the whole audience cracking up throughout the entire show. So it's half comedy, half science, and 100% entertainment. So big props again to Neil deGrasse Tyson. Thoroughly enjoyed going to your show in Charlotte. As far as astronomy is concerned, it's been actually a really cool week here in Charlotte, which is pretty great to say. I told you last week that we finally had a couple of clear nights, And over the last week, I've actually had another several clear nights and actually had some clear mornings as well. And this is a super cool time of the year to get up early and check out the stars. And if you've been doing astronomy for a couple of years, you probably know what I'm going to say next as to why I'm getting up early. But if you're new and you're listening to the show and saying, why would Rue be getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to look at the stars in March? Well, that is because this is an excellent time of the year to preview the Milky Way season. So, as we know, the Earth, the sky changes throughout the year. We have our winter constellations and our summer constellations. And then in between, we have, our galaxy season in the spring. And if you wake up really early in a time like March and April, and even May to some extent, you can actually start to see some of those constellations coming up. So for example, a couple mornings ago, I woke up around 4 a.m. and I peeked out the window and saw a couple of stars. I can only see a couple from my bathroom window, but I looked out and saw a couple, and then I went back to the bed and I tapped on my phone and saw it was about 4 a.m. And I said, So then I opened up the weather app and I checked the forecast and it said clear. And then I thought to myself, I'm not that tired right now, and I'm not going to be that tired at 6 a.m. So why bother with 2 more hours of sleep when I could go check out some summer stars? So I went ahead and got some clothes on and headed outside. It wasn't that chilly out. And sure enough, it was nice and clear out. So I broke out my wide field rig. That's my 135 Rokinon lens that sits on my Star Adventure GTI. And I pointed it at Rho Ophiuchus, which is probably my favorite wide field target that there is. Honestly, it's just so beautiful. If you've never seen it, you should definitely Google it. If you just look up RHO and then start typing OPH, you will find it. But it's a beautiful, very large nebula region. It's off to the side of the core of the Milky Way. If you're in the northern hemisphere, it's on the right side of the core. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it's on the left side of the core. But it's just an absolutely beautiful nebula region, and I wanted to see if I could, get a look at it. So I set that up, and it was funny because it was super clear when I first walked out. But by the time I got polar aligned and then had the ASI air pointing at Rho, clouds had rolled in. And I was like, man, you've got to be kidding me. I was like, this is just my luck. And, I had checked the forecast and it said it was going to be clear, all the way till sunrise. And luckily, after about 5 minutes, it was just a few clouds. They passed and then it was clear the rest of the morning. So I got that going and I was doing 60-second exposures. And I'm in, as I've told you guys before, I'm just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina in a Bortle 6 and honestly borderline 7. And, you need a light pollution filter for a situation like that. I'm quite lucky that my southern sky does not have a very big city directly in that area. So I don't get like a huge light dome effect, but there's still a lot of light pollution in the area. And, the Milky Way core is low on the horizon where I am. So there's going to be a lot of light pollution to contend with. So I'm going to talk about some filters and how you can fight that light pollution today. And we'll get to that in a moment. But I set up the camera, and I had my favorite filter, which is my L Pro filter, on that rig running to cut through some of that light pollution. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, this would be a great chance to check out that other new lens that I bought, which I told you guys about a few weeks ago, the 7.5 millimeter fisheye lens from TT Artisans that was just $129. So I went ahead and I grabbed my Canon R7 and my tripod. I didn't even bother with the Sky Guider because I thought it would be fun to do a time lapse with this lens. So I grabbed that and I set it up beside the other rig, and I pointed that, towards the southern part of the sky. But honestly, the view is so wide that I got probably nearly 180 degrees of the sky. It's kind of crazy. Well, 90 degrees of the sky, I should say. 180 degrees would be the entire sky. So yeah, nearly 90 degrees of the sky, and pointed that like kind of lower-ish to the horizon so you could see the top of the houses and the trees in the lower part of the frame. And I started taking 15-second shots, ISO 100, because that thing lets in so much light. It was f 2.0, I want to say, f 1.8 or 2.0. I'll check it in a few minutes. But yeah, 100, anything higher than 100, and it was just getting blown out. So I had to really drop the ISO on that. And I was taking 15-second exposures and then just, letting it do its thing. I set it on auto with unlimited exposures. And long story short, it was a great morning, and I did get a look at the time lapse later, and though it was faint, I was able to pick out the Milky Way. So that was super cool. I got my first glimpse at the Milky Way. What I think I'm going to do, I've actually got a clear morning coming up tomorrow. So I'm debating on waking up early and seeing if I can get a better shot at the Milky Way, maybe get a slightly narrower lens and focus in more on the core, maybe put a light pollution filter on it too, to help that out, and, see what I can come up with. So light pollution filters, let's talk about those. So there's a lot of different kinds of filters that you can buy in astrophotography. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot. Especially when you get into like monochrome imaging, that's a little bit more advanced. And just full disclosure, I am not doing monochrome imaging yet. I am still a one-shot color guy. I am starting to eyeball my first monochrome camera, and I've got a pretty good idea of which one I want to get, but I have not stuck my foot in that water quite yet. However, that being said, I do have a good bit of knowledge with the filters that I do own, and I own a few, and I think they're very, very good filters, just given the experience that I've had with them. One of them lives pretty much full time in my main telescope because it is an excellent filter, and for the price, I find it to be unbeatable. Another one of the filters was the very first one that I bought, and it was a clip-in filter for my DSLR, which was, or is, I should say, I still have it, a Canon T3i that is Astro modded. And then finally, I also own a Duo narrowband filter, which is another awesome type of light pollution filter, but it's a little bit different, and I'll explain why. But these are all excellent examples of filters that reduce light pollution for you. And this is really important because most of us, the vast majority of us, do not live in Bortle 1 through 4 skies. And honestly, even if you do live in a Bortle 4 sky, you can benefit from things like Duo narrowband filters, because when the full moon is out, you can still image with a one-shot color camera with something like a duo band filter. Now, in particular, what we're going to be talking about today, there's 3 of them. So I am going to be talking about an Optolong filter, and they sell several of them, but I in particular own one called the L Pro model. And then we are going to be talking about a duo band filter, which is an extremely affordable one that ZWO makes. I'm sure you've heard of them. They make the ASI Air and a whole bunch of other stuff. And we are also going to be talking about a filter that is made by a company called Astronomic. And this is where I would actually like to start, because DSLRs and mirrorless cameras still are one of the most popular places to start with astrophotography, just because so many people already own a DSLR or a mirrorless camera when they start their journey into astrophotography. So this is really a natural first filter for people to buy. It was the first one that I bought because I already owned a couple of Canon cameras. They make it for a few different cameras, but in particular, I own the Canon clip-in filter. It basically just clips in right where, before your lens, but after your sensor. So right in that area, you clip in the filter, and it basically blocks out all of the light pollution from getting to the sensor. Now, that being said, I do feel like DSLRs and mirrorless cameras aren't quite as popular as beginner cameras as they used to be just 2 or 3 years ago, even, just because the one-shot color astronomy cooled cameras are getting cheaper and cheaper all the time, particularly with companies like ZWO releasing this new $599 one-shot color camera. I mean, they're getting more and more affordable all the time. And as that trend continues, I expect DSLRs and mirrorless cameras will be used less and less often. But that being said, if you own a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, this would be an excellent option for you to look at. So basically, like I said, you would clip it in. It's going to work with any lens or telescope, if you attach your Canon or Nikon or whatever you are using directly to a telescope. And these filters work at f3 or above. So if you have something that's incredibly fast, like a Rokinon lens that's f2.0, then it might not work so well. But if it's f3 or higher, that's what it's rated to work at. That's not to say you couldn't use it with the Rokinon, but you might need to stop it down a couple times to, f3 or lower. Now, all that being said, this filter is a little bit pricier than when I first bought it. It's going for $130 now on highpointscientific.com. That's $129.95 US. If all you have is a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, I can still recommend this filter, particularly if you live in a heavily light polluted area. If you're Bortle 6, 7, 8 or higher, God forbid, then it really is still an easy recommendation, even at that price point, because it does do a very good job at blocking out that unwanted light pollution. But at the $130 price point, you do start approaching what could be considered some really, higher, nicer quality filters that could be used in a, 1.25 inch mounted or 2 inch even mounted configuration, which is what we're going to talk about next. But before we get to that, I think it would be a good time to talk about what an Astro modified DSLR or mirrorless camera is. So I mentioned earlier that I have a T3i Astro modified camera. And you may ask yourself, Rue, what's an Astro modified camera? What does that mean? So generally speaking, most cameras that you buy have special filters that are inside of them to block out unwanted light from entering into the sensor. Usually this is going to be UV, so ultraviolet, and IR, which is infrared light. You don't want UV and IR light entering into your sensor because it can mess up your sensor. It can make your images look weird, et cetera, et cetera. It can make, basically higher reds in your photos, so they will look significantly warmer than they should. However, as an astronomer, we do want those extra wavelengths of light. They are very, very important. In fact, a lot of the most important wavelengths of light, such as hydrogen alpha from things like emission nebula, are very visible at the infrared wavelength. So if your camera is not Astro modified and you're taking a photo of something like let's say the North American nebula that is very rich in hydrogen alpha, then you're not going to be able to pick up on as many of those beautiful red colors as you would with a camera that has that Astro modification done. So if you're looking to get an Astro modified camera, perhaps you already own a camera and you're looking to Astro modify your own, there are plenty of companies out there that will do it for you for a very reasonable price. What I did is I went on Cloudy Nights, which is an excellent website for forums, reviews, and classifieds for our purpose. And I was able to actually purchase a Canon T3i that was already Astro modified by somebody who did, tons of them. That's basically what they did as a side income, was modified cameras and then sold them for a very reasonable price. I believe I bought mine for $250 or so, and that was a few years ago. So I wouldn't imagine they're terribly expensive. Obviously, they are older cameras at this point. The technology is pretty old, but for astrophotography, they're actually excellent cameras and they're still quite popular. A lot of astronomers still use those Canon, 600D and T3i type cameras, and some slightly newer ones like the T5i or what have you. But being Astro modified is a great way to go. And if you combine that with something like that astronomic CLS light pollution filter, then you can really hit a sweet spot where you're able to gather a lot of nebulosity from a camera that's not very expensive. So, dual band filters. I actually was talking to a friend of mine named Braxton today, who is a member of our astronomy club, because I was trying to get some advice from him on my Rokinon 135 lens, which is something that I've been struggling with since I purchased it. I'm still not convinced I don't have like a less than stellar copy of this lens, but Perhaps not. Perhaps it's just issues on my end and I need to tweak some things. I'm not giving up on it. I actually have invested a little bit more money. I bought an electronic autofocuser for it, which I think will be great because it is very finicky with the focus. I've been using a bat knob mask up until now, which if you don't know what a bat knob mask is, it's basically a type of lens cap with cutouts in it that you place on top of the end of the lens, basically. And then you take a photo and it will put an X over your points of light or stars. And then when you get that X basically perfectly perpendicular with a line going through the middle of it, then you know you're in focus. But anyway, we were talking about dual band filters because he uses I believe it's an Antilla 3 nanometer dual band filter, which is a very, very nice dual band filter. And it's specifically made for high speed lenses. And that's important because the lens that we both have, the Rokinon lens, is an f2 lens. And if you want to be able to take full advantage of gathering all that light, then you're going to want to have a filter that is capable of working at f2. Now, that's not to say that you couldn't buy a less expensive dual band filter like an SV Bony 7 nanometer dual band filter for around $120 for the 2-inch variety of that. But you would need to stop your lens down to f3 or f4, and it wouldn't be quite as ideal as the faster filters. So the way that these are designed, basically, you have to have, I don't know if it's the coatings in particular or the glass itself or the thickness of the glass, but basically, if you need to have a filter made for a very fast piece of glass, it is basically a fancier piece of kit than one that works with a standard, f5.6 type refractor scope. And I'm dumbing it way down. Forgive me if anyone knows a ton about filters and they're like, no, don't. I'm just trying to put it out in layman's terms. So that being said, if you have a one-shot color camera and you're wanting to image at times like, let's say when the moon is more than half full or even during full moon, and there are bright nebula that are out, and in particular emission nebula. So think things like the Horsehead Nebula or the Eagle Nebula or the Carina or the Orion Nebula, Lagoon Nebula even would be a good example. So the reason I say emission nebula is because those are very rich in hydrogen alpha and even O3 signal. And the reason that's important is because, as the name implies, dual band, these filters are letting in a very specific band length of light. So hydrogen alpha and then O3 or doubly ionized oxygen. So these types of nebula work very great with dual band filters, but other types of targets such as galaxies, for example, that may not be rich in hydrogen alpha and O3 would not be a good use for these types of filters. So, when it's summertime and it's nebula season, dual band filters are an excellent tool to have if you're in an urban environment or if the moon's out and you want to get out and image. One of them nearly lives on one of my rigs whenever it's nebula season. But in the springtime, if you're mainly imaging galaxies, or if you're, looking at something that is not rich in Ha or O3, then you're not going to want to use a dual band filter because you won't really get any signal. Another cool thing about dual narrowband is it gives you a lot of options when you go to actually process the images, because you're able to split up those signals individually, and then you're able to actually do what they call a Hubble color palette if you're using a program like PixInsight, for example, and you can actually recreate similar color palettes to what the Hubble uses in its images, which is really neat. I remember last summer on the North American Nebula in particular, I took a 4-hour exposure of the North American Nebula, and it was my first time trying a Hubble palette. I don't think it came out wonderful, but I think it came out pretty good, all things considered. And then I also did a Hubble palette on the Heart Nebula, and that's honestly one of my favorite images that I've done to date. I think it came out beautiful. So that's a really cool thing that you can do with a dual narrowband filter. But that being said, if you have a one-shot color camera, a dual narrowband isn't your only way to go. So let's say that you want to shoot something that doesn't fall under the emission nebula. So let's say you want to shoot galaxies, like let's say M51, the pinwheel galaxy is up and you want to shoot that. Sorry, that's not the pinwheel. That's the whirlpool galaxy. I apologize. But anyway, if you had a whirlpool galaxy or a similar galaxy to that, then you could look at something like an L Pro, which is a broadband, and some people will call it a fancy light pollution filter, but it's a broadband light pollution filter that you can use, and it is made by Optolong, similar to the L Enhance, L Extreme, and L Ultimate variety of filters that they put out. The L Pro in particular is my favorite filter. It's not extremely popular. I don't see a whole lot of people talking about it on all the various websites and forums that I frequent, but I love my L Pro. It pretty much lives on my main rig, which is my 80 ED doublet. And I have had nothing but success with that. So I have the 1 1/4 inch version. And after I bought it, I almost immediately wish I had gone with the 2-inch version for a multitude of reasons. And it's not just because men always want things to be bigger, but it turns out that 2-inch filters can be handy for several reasons. But I went with the 1 1/4 inch version, and I don't actually own a filter wheel yet. And when you get a filter wheel, you can do a 1 1/4 inch filter wheel or a 2-inch filter wheel. So maybe I'll stick with 1 1/4 inch. I haven't really decided yet. I think ultimately, when I get into filter wheels, that'll probably be when I get into mono camera imaging, which I have not dived into quite yet. And that's something that I am kind of exploring right now, because I am starting to look at getting a second cooled astronomy camera, and I've narrowed down to a few picks. I don't think I'm going to go with that 585 that I have mentioned several times over the last couple episodes, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. But the L Pro by Optolong, again, it's been an excellent filter for me. You can get the 2-inch version for $199, and I believe the 1 1/4 inch version goes for $149. And most telescopes allow you to install a 1.25 inch filter, and oftentimes a 2-inch filter as well. If you have like an M48 connector, you can generally screw in a 2-inch filter. It's going to vary from scope to scope. And in my case, lens to lens, because I have a Rokinon, and I am actually thinking about buying another filter, which is something that I'm about to start talking about now, which is something I mentioned earlier, one of those very fast, capable of doing f2 dual narrowband filters. And I noticed very quickly when I started looking into these that they are a lot more expensive than what I've become accustomed to. So the company Antlia makes an excellent one that goes for about $380, but that appears to be sold out pretty much everywhere. It goes with a dual band pass of 5 nanometers. So I'm actually considering, again, Optolong, a 2-inch L Extreme F2 dual band filter. And this one's a little bit wider of a band pass at 7 nanometers. But after watching some reviews today, it's supposed to be very good with minimizing halo effect, which is something that you do see on a lot of, I'm not going to say cheaper, but I'll say faster dual band filters, that halos can appear on your stars. And to be perfectly honest, I don't have a ton of experience with cheap dual band filters. I do own an SV Boni 1.25 inch dual narrowband filter that I mentioned earlier. I think I picked that up for just $79. And honestly, that's been a great filter. It has not really produced any halos, so I haven't had any trouble out of that, but I'm imaging at, f5.6 with that. So not really fast by, modern standards. But at f2, obviously things become a lot more, exacting, I guess you could say, and you have to be much more precise with the instruments that you choose. When you're collecting light that quick, any little imperfections are going to show up just greatly magnified. So Optolong L Extreme F2, that one's going for $309. However, it looks like it gets amazing results. I'm quite happy with the results that I'm seeing thus far. So I'm definitely going to check that out. So I briefly mentioned filter wheels earlier, and filter wheels are something that I have not yet purchased. I'm considering purchasing one, but again, like I mentioned, I'm not doing mono imaging yet, and I don't really feel like one is necessary if you're not doing mono imaging. Is it good to have? Yeah, absolutely, because you can install multiple filters, a UV IR cut filter, a duo narrowband filter, an L Pro filter, and just quickly switch between them, which is, wonderful. But there are other ways to quickly switch between filters without having to purchase a $300 filter wheel. What I looked at when I'm considering for my trip, actually, ZWO makes a really nice M48 size filter drawer. And what this has is basically a magnetic drawer that you can screw a 2-inch filter into, and it also accepts 1.25 inch filters. It comes with an adapter, so you can use a 1.25 inch filter. So whichever size you're using, it'll work with either. But basically, you can then slide that drawer into it, and it's 20 millimeters wide, which is a very common extension tube size on most telescopes. So it helps you reach back focus very easily. And you can buy extra drawers for it. So, most of the, ZWO 5 whole wheels are going to start at $299 for the electronic one. I believe $299 to $399 for the 5 to 7 spot wheels. I said whole wheels, but 5 to 7 filter wheels. There are cheaper ones out there, like manual wheels that you can buy where you just manually turn it to whichever filter you want. But I've seen some quality issues on the ones that I've seen thus far to where I wouldn't buy one. If I was going to buy one, I would want to get an electronic one that I could program to automatically change to the filter that I'm going to use, because ultimately I'd probably end up using it with a mono camera if I went that route. And I would want to be able to do, like LRGB, SHO, or, whatever mono I decide to go with if I went with, like a 7 filter wheel, for example. But in the interim, I can save a lot of money and have something that works really great with a one-shot color camera by getting a simple $79 ZWO filter drawer. And then you can buy an additional drawer for it. So if you've got, let's say, I'm going to shoot a duo narrowband on something large like the Sator region, and I want to collect hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3 for several hours. But then when I'm done collecting all of that data, I just want to slide in a UV IR cut filter so I can get some really good RGB star data for, 20 minutes or what have you. I can just quickly remove that magnetic filter drawer and then slide in the other one, which has my 2-inch, IR cut filter already screwed into it, and then immediately take those photos instead of having to, decouple my camera and then unscrew everything and, screw in the new filter, which can be a real big pain in the butt. Nobody enjoys breaking down their gear like that. That will eliminate that issue for you. So I was quite happy to find that. I'm actually going to order one. I think this coming week I'm planning on ordering it. I'm kind of spreading out all the gear that I'm buying for my upcoming dark sky trip. So I'm not hitting my wallet too hard all at once. But yeah, I'm still very much looking forward to it. So to recap all of the filters, if you're a beginner and you have like a DSLR camera, definitely check out the Astronomics CLS clip-in filter. For me, it was the Canon version, but they also sell versions for various other cameras like your Nikons and what have you. So you can check those out online. Lots of the reputable sites sell them, and I'll drop the link to one of them in the show notes, of course. The iOptron L Pro filter is an excellent all-around fancy light pollution filter. It's actually a broadband filter, but that is my personal favorite filter right now. I live in a Bortle 6 borderline 7, which is, suburban skies that aren't too great. And it works very well for my, everyday imaging of pretty much any target that I point at it. It doesn't have to just be a Mission Nebula. It can be the Pleiades. It can be Orion. It can be a galaxy. Whatever I throw at that, it's going to look better with that filter. And then the L Extreme, which is the dual narrowband filter from Ioptron as well, is excellent on emission nebula. So again, emission nebula are those nebula that are very rich in hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3. Those are the, generally speaking, the big summer Milky Way type targets. There are obviously some in the winter as well. But we're talking things like the Carina Nebula, Orion, the Lagoon Nebula, the Horsehead Nebula. You get the idea. So the most popular nebula, if you will, the most, photographed, are going to work very well with a duo narrowband filter. And you don't have to get the L Extreme. There are less expensive versions. ZWO and SV Boni make an excellent version. But I am buying the high speed version. And if any of you are using the Rokinon 135 f2 lens, I would highly recommend that you look into that. You could, again, as I said earlier, you can stop down that lens to f4 or so and use one of the less expensive lenses. But if you want to shoot it wide open at f2, check out the f2 version of the L Extreme. So that's going to do it for the filter portion of the show. And I just wanted to briefly touch on why I was kind of thinking about filters so much and what brought me to that f2 filter ultimately. I had a couple of decisions to make. I actually recently got my bonus at work, and it's very rare for me to buy myself anything. Me and my wife don't really buy ourselves much, but I told myself this year I worked really hard and I wanted to get myself something. I don't know if you're anything like me, but I'll go out and look at really expensive stuff and then I won't ever actually buy it for myself. So I initially was thinking like, maybe I'll get myself a new camera. And I went and looked and I was like, man, that ASI 2600 MC, it was MC Pro on sale for $14.99 right now, which is, I think like 500 less than it used to be, maybe 300 less, but I think it's because the Duo is out now. It's cheaper. And that's just an awesome camera, but I just can't bring myself to spend that kind of money right now. And so I was thinking maybe under $1,000. And I said to myself, what could I get the most results for under $1,000 on this dark sky trip that I'm taking? And then I thought, I've been having so many issues getting this Rokinon lens performing, exactly how I want it to. And I started thinking about getting a Red Cat. And if you don't know, Red Cats are extremely popular Petzval design refractor telescopes that William Optics makes. And they've recently come out with their version 3, which is so much better, in my opinion, than version 1 and version 2, because it has an internal focuser that is not a helical focuser. So the original version 1 and version 2 used a non-standard helical focuser. And unfortunately for us astrophotographers, that means that it wasn't easily usable with an electronic autofocuser. There are custom ways that you can make it work with a belt system, which is actually what I'm going to be doing with my Rokinon, ironically. But just straight out of the box with an electronic autofocuser, it would not work. A lot of people were perfectly fine with just using the built-in Batinov mask, because it does come with a Batinov mask. They're kind of famous for that. The lens caps on the Red Cats actually have a really nice built-in Batinov mask, which is a device that goes on the front of your telescope that you can use to focus your stars by diffracting the light as it enters into the telescope. But anyway, they came out with the version 3 of these Red Cats. And they have a 51, 61, and 71 that range anywhere from $850 to, I believe, around $1,800. And I, of course, was looking at the 51, the $850-ish one. And I was strongly considering it. I even went to my wife and was like, hey, do you mind if I buy this telescope? And we were talking about it, and I took a step back and I was thinking about it. And I said to myself, the Red Cat can image at f4.9, which is really good for a refractor. However, it's a 51 millimeter aperture scope. So that's actually significantly smaller than my Rokinon lens. Now, it does have a 250 millimeter focal length, which is about double what the Rokinon lens is. The Rokinon obviously is 135. And with the Red Cat being 250, that will give you a more zoomed in look, but still a very wide field of view. in terms of astrophotography, you can still capture, very large targets at 250 millimeters. But then I started lining up the types of targets that I would want to shoot between 135 and 250 millimeters with things like a Red Cat or my Rokinon. And I pretty quickly realized that the 135 focal length was actually more preferable than the 250. Particularly when I looked at Ro Ofuichi. No one can say that right the first time they say it. I've said it a million times and I still can't say it right. But it's a beautiful nebulous region off the Milky Way, and it is one of the targets that I plan on shooting when I'm out on my dark sky trip. And being able to image at f2 versus f4.9 is a very, very, very big difference. If you don't know a lot about photography, you might think f2 to f4.9 doesn't sound like that big of a difference. So believe it or not, that f2 in comparison to f4.9 lets in more than twice as much light as the f4.9. So just think about that. I can gather in 30 minutes what the Red Cat could gather in 1 hour. So when I'm going on a trip to somewhere where I've only got 3 nights, and I might not even have 3 nights, that's assuming that the weather is good all 3 nights. Last year we got really lucky and we had great weather all 3 nights. But there's no guarantee on that. I might only get good weather for 1 night, and I need to be able to maximize that time and get as much data as possible. So once I started thinking about that, I started thinking to myself, I've got a friend named Braxton down at the observatory who also has a Rokinon 135, and I know that he gets excellent results out of it. So I sent him a message and we started talking about it, and I sent him a few of my subs, and he looked at him and he made some suggestions to me on how to correct the problems that I was seeing. And I think I may have mentioned a little bit of this earlier, but long story short, I decided to go all in on the Rokinon lens, and I am going to get that L Extreme f2 filter. I've already got the new electronic autofocuser. I have the autofocuser kit on the way. That is a special kit because the Rokinon uses a helical focuser, like I was talking about with the old versions of the Red Cat. And in order to make it work with a ZWO autofocuser, you need to be able to attach a special piece, basically, that allows a belt to rotate over that helical focuser to focus your stars. But for me, most importantly, the piece that I have ordered is a replacement bayonet for the back of the lens. So a bayonet, if you do not know, is the connecting piece on the back of a camera lens that you actually insert into the camera body and then twist. So it is the part basically that interlocks to your camera. So for most cameras, for day-to-day use in light or even nighttime shots, a bayonet is perfectly fine. However, with a telescope where we're taking very long exposures at sometimes very demanding f-stops, such as f2, any imperfection as far as tilting is concerned is just greatly magnified. And what I was noticing on my Rokinon was bad tilt. So no matter what I did, the right field of the stars just didn't look good at all. They were elongated. I could perfectly focus the middle of the field, and the stars on the right-hand side just looked ugly. And then when I noticed that, I carefully looked at the camera, and then I kind of lifted up a little, and I realized it's sagging in that direction, or opposite of that direction. It's nearly imperceptible. To the naked eye, you wouldn't even notice it if you weren't looking super closely and, carefully moving the camera on the back. But that's all it takes when you're shooting at f2 on a 77 millimeter lens. Just that little tiny bit of imperfection makes your, entire right side of the image look terrible. So what the bayonet does is it allows me to basically completely remove what would normally be the connection point to a Canon camera and instead install a standardized M48 connection, which is the, screw-on type connection that we use for telescopes, and therefore completely avoid the issue that I am currently having with tilt. So I am super excited about that. So that was actually from First Light Optics, which is a company, I believe they're based in England. I will drop a link to them in the show notes in case any of you guys have this issue as well. I think it really depends on several factors if you experience this, because I know several people who have this same lens and similar cameras to what I use, which is the ASI 294 MC Pro, and they do not have these issues that I am having. I've done everything that I can to address it. You know, I bought the ZWO camera holder and mounted that to the bottom of the dovetail. I've bought a tilt adapter plate. I've stopped down the lens, you know, everything that I can possibly do, I've tried to do. And at this point, I'm just going to replace the bayonet so I can get a rock solid connection. If it still looks ugly after that, okay, well, then maybe it's time to look at a different telescope. But until I get to that point, I'm going to attempt to use the Rokinon because it is capable of wonderful astrophotography images if I can only get it to image properly. So the only question that begs, though, is what is my other rig going to do? I only have one pro cooled astronomy camera right now, which is the 294 MC Pro that I mentioned earlier. I do have a Canon T3i. It's very old. It's an Astro modded version that I bought for, I want to say like $250 several years ago when I was first getting in. It was the first camera I used in astrophotography, but it leaves a lot to be desired in terms of quality. I think the sensor's kind of really worn out on it. That being said, I am going to give it one more shot before I replace the bayonet on the 135 lens, just because, you know, if I could get that working to an acceptable degree, then I would gladly use that down on my dark sky trip so I could let the 294 run on my larger rig, which is my SV Bony 80 ED doublet with a focal reducer. Because if I put the 294 on the Rokinon lens all night, then my big scope isn't going to be able to shoot anything. And I definitely also would like to get some more close-up shots of some of the targets out there. So, you know, Rho is high on my list, and the Blue Horsehead Nebula is also high on my list. But there are several targets I would like to be able to get a close-up view of. So having two cameras going at the same time, 3 even, because I want to do Milky Way shots, is going to be very important. Something else that happened this week that's pretty cool is our friend and friend of the show, Mr. Rick Bassam, actually hit me up and asked if I was going to NEAF this year. If you don't know, that's the Northeast Astronomy Forum and Space Expo. They hold it every year up in New York. It's a long weekend where basically all of the astronomy companies come out and they show off all their new tech. They have world-class speakers, awesome conferences, and they sell gear. And it's a really cool show to go to. I have not been myself yet. I would certainly love to go. And that's actually what he was asking me about. He was asking me if I am going this year and if I would like to go. So I am looking into it. I realize how cool of an episode that would make for the Astrocast. I don't know if it's going to work out with my schedule yet. There are a couple of things that hugely hinge on whether or not I'll be able to make it work, and I will be finding out about those in the coming week. So if I can make it work, I will let you guys know on next week's episode. And, hopefully that'll all fall into place. And if it does, then that'll make for an awesome story for sure. Also wanted to give another quick shout out to our Patreon subscriber, Carrie Hazelton. Thank you so much for being a subscriber to the Astrocast. That is patreon.com/the Astrocast. If you would like to join, we are going to be doing a listener meetup in the coming months on Discord. And I would love to have a bunch of you guys join me so we can talk astronomy one night, get together, and maybe even do a couple of live streams of some really fun gear tutorials and what have you. So definitely got some big plans for that. Again, if you want to check it out and support the show, that is patreon.com/the Astrocast. If you do decide to become a member, just know that your $5 a month will go towards advertising the show so we can bring more folks into the family. This week, I do have a really cool recommendation for you. I mentioned the Neil deGrasse show that I saw last week, Neil deGrasse Tyson, sorry about that. And I actually picked up one of his books that I had not read. It's one of the great courses actually on Audible, and it's called My Favorite Universe, and it's basically a group of lectures that he gives. And funnily enough, it was very, very similar to the lecture that I saw him give live, but kind of a very deep extended cut of it, because it was about 6 hours long in comparison to the 2.5 hours I believe he did on stage in Charlotte here. So if you want to hear a really awesome, Neil deGrasse Tyson course, if you will, on astronomy, I would highly recommend checking that out. Again, it's the great courses. It's called My Favorite Universe, and it's on Audible. I think they have it on sale this week for just $10. If you're one of the person who doesn't like to use their Audible credits whenever books are on sale like me, you can pick it up for just $10. So that's my recommendation for this week. And with all that being said, I think that's going to just about do it for us this week, guys. I thank you all so much for tuning in to the Astrocast. This is our 11th episode. I want to apologize one more time for the 2 weeks that we were gone. This is a one-man band here at Astrocast HQ. So, when things happen, as life often does, sometimes I have to step away and handle it. But I'm happy to be back, and I plan on being back next week as well. So we will see you then and there. April 8th is the solar eclipse, so make sure you stay tuned for that. Hopefully you have clear skies, and maybe if you're really lucky, you're in the path of totality. I'm starting to consider driving 8 hours. Clear skies. Back again, huh? Looking for another podcast recommendation? Got a special one for you this week. It's called The Backyard Naturalists, ran by a very good friend of mine and very popular nature podcast. Highly recommend you check it out. Available on all platforms. They've got 100 episodes for you to listen to. If you enjoy nature, you will enjoy the show. Thanks, guys. Clear skies.